Yeah, so I wanted to talk to you about this idea, three views of personhood. And I can't get real deep into all these aspects, but I want to show you, at least lay out at a 30,000-foot view, how different people with different theological perspectives on the topic of origins explain what it means to be a human, explain what it means to have personhood. And really, I think the danger of especially the theistic evolution side, as opposed to the special creation view, the idea that Adam and Eve are created as the original humans and they're the sole progenitors of every living human that came into existence. And I think that view there's challenges we've all faced in terms of understanding the text or understanding the science. But I think it provides the most coherent argument, what I say in my research, against a lot of the dehumanization that takes place. And this is where my research comes in. This is where I spent the last many years studying. I did my Master of Arts and Science Religion. It was on the issue of Hebrew cosmology, which kind of got me into Adam and Eve, which then led me down this road. And I said, well, how can I get people to be passionate about this biblical doctrine when a lot of young people don't care about doctrine? They care about moral and social issues. So what I argue in my thesis is that the biblical revelation of the historical Adam and Eve, created as the sacred beings in God's image and the progenitors of all humankind, provide the most coherent ethical framework for knowing every life is sacred and the best foundation for rejecting socio-political dehumanization of any group of humans. Now, my focus is racism in my thesis, but I think the principle applies to any category of dehumanization that we can come up with. And culture has a great way of inventing a lot of ways to dehumanize other. So let's look here at sort of the Darwinian evolution and the problem of personhood. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I just want to give a baseline for what we're going to evaluate. Now, this is a really complicated chart. I use this with my students. I've taught this for a few years, and how we look at personhood. But the first thing I want to look at is this idea of physicalism. And if you look here, really I want to spend on this part right here, and then the bottom one. We won't spend a lot of time in those other places. And so we're going to look at that first column. So basically, for those who are naturalists, those that deny the existence of a supernatural God creator, that the material world is all there is, right? This is one of the primary views that they hold. Not the only, but the primary views of personhood, where essentially all is nature. Everything, whether you call it a mind or body, so you can call it whatever you want, and maybe there's different aspects to those things, but essentially all is material. All is a part of nature and reflected in a material reality. Where it gets to the crux of it is the last one on personhood. And that personhood is really seen as subjectivity. Individuality and personhood are illusions. There is no self-consciousness. So the idea that you are conscious and aware of yourself, the idea that you say, I have a sense of I or a sense of being, that's an illusion of nature, meant to help you survive or just get along and to, compensate for all the struggles that nature throws at you. And so what you recognize as self-awareness or consciousness is really just a trick of your biology to help you survive. Okay? So with that understanding, there's a basic argument. And I actually spent quite a long time trying to boil this down to a basic premise one, premise two, conclusion type statement, because I'm trying to make it as understandable as possible, but at the same time being as fair as possible to the people who hold this position. So I think this is pretty fair. So premise one of this argument, for those who are naturalists or Darwinian evolutionists, is that evolving biological systems are the natural explanation for human personhood. So that's, we evolved through natural selection. That explains what it means, what we call human personhood. Premise two is evolving biological systems are indeterminate. That is, systems they've always have evolved and always will continue to evolve. So what you classify as a human today is not necessarily what you would classify as a human in the future. And that leads to the conclusion, therefore, human personhood is also indeterminate because it's a contingent property. It depends on our biological state or our biological systems. So as those systems we see historically, thus the argument went, those with biological systems that couldn't survive the rigors of whatever environment they're in were lower on the evolutionary scale than those who had better biological systems. So they had more value to the society and more worth as an individual. Okay, so that's the basic premise, and we can come back to that if you have questions. But what I want to really look at and spend a few more minutes on is this idea of theistic evolution, especially within the naturalist kind. There's supernaturalistic and naturalistic. Supernaturalists say, okay, well, God intervened somewhere magically along the way and did this. Naturalistic theistic evolutions say God set it all in motion. It's more like a deist kind of thing, where God set it in motion, but he didn't interfere with the process. And so, at least within that framework, we have this idea that personhood becomes an emergent property of our biology. And what does this mean? So an emergent property is simply understood this way. So by analogy, hydrogen, H, doesn't have the property of wetness. Oxygen does not have the property of wetness. But if you put a couple hydrogen and an oxygen molecule together, then you have this property that emerges that we call wetness, at least in its liquid state. So that's the example of what an emergent property is, and that's for the emergentist kind of theistic evolutionists. That's what they say personhood is. You put this chemical together with this chemical and this system and the endocrine system, and all these things come together, and somehow personhood emerged from that collection of biological systems, right? So that's it. Now, again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time unpacking these charts. I just want to kind of show you a couple key elements of those and how different people take this differently. And how they, within that idea of an emergent personhood, they have different approaches. So you have to be really careful when you're reading people to kind of understand what that is. So first, there's this group of physicalists. Now, you noticed earlier for the Darwinists, they were also physicalists. They had that view that all is nature. Well, physicalists who are Christians really essentially recognize that all is nature in that sense that we're all physical beings. There is no spiritual, there's no soulish reality that's separate from the physical reality, but it's a property that does emerge out of physical realities. So like wetness is a part of water. You can't have wetness independent of water, right? Well, you can't have personhood independent of your biological system. So there's no such thing as a soul that's distinct from your biology within this view. And what that does essentially, if you look at that last column that's blue there, under this what's called non-reductive emergentism, that is, we can't reduce this idea of personhood just to a specific biological system, although it's still dependent fully on that biological system. It gets kind of complicated, right? That's why we're doing the 30,000-foot view here. But they say personhood is this: a material yet non-biological interactive emergent property between biological environment and social systems. So what that means is that personhood is you can discern it as something else, although it's still connected to the biology. And the way it represents itself, or the way it stands out, the thing that sets humans apart from apes then is our social systems, the way we interact, the way we can love one another and care for one another. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us a person, is our capacity for moral choice, our capacity for love. And so our sort of behaviors are essentially that distinguishing mark. Now, another emergentist view, this used to be from a guy, John Stuart Mill. So if you read Mill's stuff, you can see this. It's called emergent dualism. So the first, physicalism, some people call that monism. In other words, everything is one, right? There's only a physical reality. Well, you have what's called property dualists. Well, they say, well, there's who we are. The essence of who we are is expressed in two different properties. There's a material property and a non-material property. So they're actually distinct properties of what makes a human a person. And you can see that in the descriptions, and I can get you access to the slides or whatever if you want to really study those things. But again, I just want to focus on that last idea of what is personhood. So for a property dualist, they say personhood is the absence of personhood, or the absence of emergent mental capacities indicates the absence of personhood. So in other words, when you have these emergent properties of consciousness, of intelligence, of moral, awareness or social awareness, those emerge. And so when you lack those things, you lack personhood. So that's why you can say an ape, doesn't have those things. That's the reason an ape isn't a human person. It's not because biologically they're any, significantly different. It's just that they don't have that property that we would associate with what we call personhood. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, at least in how those two main groups. But let me go back to this point and just share with you a couple elements of this that are important to look at. Let me see if I have this. Yes. Let's see. No, I didn't do that. All right. So for this, a theistic evolutionist describes basically there's a spectrum, is what I wanted you guys to get from that part, of monogenic theories. There's a spectrum of ideas of what our source is. We all had one source, they say. There's a universal common descent. They try to say all humans are connected or related somehow, but there's a spectrum of ideas of what that's reflected by, okay? So we have to be careful, again, when we read people, not to put them all exactly in one camp in terms of the nuance or the subtleties. But in general, I think there's a couple things that are pretty clear for all of these. All of them will accept that on one level or another, personhood is what I said, an emergent property. So on some level, in some way, personhood is an emergent property. There are different explanations, and the philosophy gets wild, and trying to understand it hurts your head a lot. There's different science explanations, and that hurts your head for other reasons. And you can't be an academic unless you write really obscure things that nobody cares about, and then they say, wow, that must be deep because I don't understand it. Yeah. But if you boil all that down, I think there's a commonality in at least that element as well. And they also accept that some sort of neo-Darwinian biological explanation, it's not Darwin anymore, but it's still Darwin in some way, explanation. And they use that as the hermeneutic for interpreting not just Genesis, but what it means to be human itself. So we have to say that the fact that humans evolved from lower animals, that animal to human evolution, is the framework that we need to know. We have to take that fact or that truth and now use that to interpret not only the scripture, but interpret our understanding of personhood. What they both reject is the actual idea of de novo creation, that God made Adam and Eve, Adam from the dust of the ground, Eve from his side, as a miraculous act, as separate beings from the animals. That is rejected across the board, regardless of the nuance of where they go with this. Okay? So, if I boil their argument down that we have from there for the theistic evolutionists, especially those who are naturalistic in their worldview, I think all kind of fall into this to some degree. But again, I have to allow for some room because that's what academics do. We have to understand there's always exceptions. So premise one looks familiar. This is the same premise we saw with Darwin. Evolving biological systems are the natural explanation for human personhood. Premise two is that evolving biological systems are indeterminate. That is, they're always changing, they're always evolving. There's a non-stable nature in that sense of what will survive based on environmental conditions in the changing world. But now here's where a unique part comes in. These next three ideas are unique within theistic evolution. Premise three, all emergent properties, mind, consciousness, soul, are contingent on the evolving biological system. So premise four, any emergent property that is contingent on an indeterminate biological system is itself indeterminate. So if my mind and my consciousness is contingent, depends on my biological system for its status, for its nature in some way, then if that system that it relies on is indeterminate, then that thing that emerges from it also must be indeterminate. In other words, changeable. You can even go back to the water and look at that. So wetness is an emergent property of water in a liquid state. But if water changes state, it loses its wetness, right? So if a human evolving biological system has an emergent property of personhood and the biological state changes, then that emergent property can also change its nature or its state. And that leads us to the fourth premise here. The fifth premise. Human personhood is a contingent property of the human body, which then brings us to the exact same conclusion as the naturalist or the Darwinist would have. Therefore, human personhood is indeterminate. So although there's a few more steps in the process because there's a God in the mix in some way, and there's a different argument for soulishness, or whether it's an actual different property, or if it's actually physicalism, essentially they come to the same place, despite all the work to create differences along the way. All right? So here's a couple concluding statements that I think summarize those points. If human personhood is grounded in biological evolution, then the definition of personhood must change as both human organisms and scientific theories continue to evolve. So as our science changes, as our awareness of science changes, that has to influence our definition of what it means to be human, right? So that's why we say, oh, well, we don't believe what Darwin taught anymore. Well, but what he believed impacted how we viewed humans. So therefore, science will change. As scientific knowledge changes, our knowledge of what makes us human must change. If there's a consistency, if there's coherence in the argument. Now, the second point is, if personhood is defined by social systems, then the definition of personhood changes as society evolves. And many argue that personhood is a contingent property of society, or it's related to society. But if that changes, what makes us human in one society is not what makes us human in another society, depending on the values of that society. And I'll read a quote for you in a second that, you can realize I'm not making this stuff up. There are many theists who call themselves Christians who argue this very point. So the point here is that if personhood is defined, therefore the word human and the word person become a transient and accidental property. That's a philosophical term that I can unpack in a second. But human and person have become a transient accidental property describing only the current state of our biological and social condition and confers no special moral status. So in other words, in philosophy, a contingent property or an accidental property, it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It's not that it's not important. It just means that it's not central to the core of who you are. That property can change, and it won't change the essence of, in this case, what you are. But personhood and the word person and human become those kind of secondary properties of what makes us us. And that becomes very problematic. Here's a quote to show you why that's problematic. Now, this is a gal, Nancy Murphy, not Nancy Pearcey, another Nancy Murphy, who's a physicalist. And she writes this: I believe that humans, now again, she's a Christian physicalist. She's a self-described, self-professed Christian, but she believes in physicalism, okay? So that's important to understand. She says, I believe that humans are not particularly biologically or cognitively unique from other primates, nor do they possess a distinct non-material substance or part. Again, that's why she's a physicalist. There's no distinct non-material part. But they are nevertheless unique in the cosmos due to the fact that human beings stand in unique relationship with one another, with families, communities, and culture. So she argued that what makes us human is the relationships we have with people. The problem I have with that is that it doesn't necessarily bring up an issue of race, although that could be argued. But what about people who are cognitively less capable? So somebody with a mental limitation, so they're born with a disability that doesn't allow them to interact with other humans in the same way. People with children with Down syndrome recognize that, they love me, but it's very different, right? It's a lot of work. And we have friends that are dear to us that, her, well, I think he's now 12, functions at about a 3-year-old level. So his contribution to society and his capacity to have a community and involve a broad community is much less than I would wager everybody in this room. I haven't met you all, but I'm going to guess it's you have a larger capacity for that, right? So according to what Nancy Murphy tells us, you have a higher degree of personhood, of value, because personhood is a contingent property of our social relationships. You can see where this gets to a lot of trouble. Because what about if you move from one culture to another? What about a culture that doesn't value somebody who is of a different race? What if in a culture that says, well, we don't value black people in our community? Well, then you have no social standing, therefore you lack personhood. Now, that would never be her argument. She would argue against that. But my point is, to argue against that is an appeal to something outside of the core of what her whole worldview is. It's an incoherent argument. It doesn't mesh with the rest. You have to make a case of special pleading to say, well, I would reject that. But why? What in your worldview, what in your science or your philosophy leads you to reject that thing? And that's the challenge that I see. So, let me get on a positive side and look at this third aspect. So those are the first two kinds of personhood we see, both in the Darwinist, the naturalist kind of worldview. We see it within the Theistic Evolutionist worldview. We see a couple approaches, but that's another view of personhood, really, within there. And now we look at a view of personhood within a classical, at least a view that's compatible with the classic statement of what we say is the traditional Christian doctrine of historic Adam and Eve as sole progenitors of every human. So inside this, we're just going to look at this last thing. And I have, you still see there's property dualism up there. You even see Cartesian dualism over here. We're not going to get into that. It's fairly, nobody really defends that sort of Cartesian dualism. What you actually read in the literature is funny because most Christians who oppose some form of dualism because like they're physicalists or they're property dualists, they actually end up arguing against Cartesian dualism from Descartes and not against Thomistic dualism. And it's kind of unfair because nobody really defends Descartes' version of this anymore. So it's unfortunate. And I think it's a little bit disingenuous how those arguments generally happen. But so some form of Thomism. J.P. Moreland has what he calls a Thomistic-like dualism. I think his version of that is very much defensible and in line with our Christian worldview. Not the only option to us, but I do like his particular view. I take that position in my own writing, and I just kind of adopt his, what he calls Thomistic-like dualism as the framework for personhood. But again, I'll say the important is that in that view, there's a physical body, there's a soul that God puts in that physical body, there's an interaction between those two. They are bound together in some way, and that binding together of the non-material soul and the material body is what makes us uniquely human. So in the last little column there at the very bottom, what we see in Thomistic dualism as far as what personhood is that personhood is a hierarchical unity of capacities which guarantees personhood. And what this means is by creating a hierarchy of certain qualities, so it could be intelligence or consciousness. What it says is these things do change. So a baby, even, well, a baby in the womb doesn't have the self-awareness that a 2-year-old has. A 2-year-old doesn't have the self-awareness or the consciousness or the intelligence of somebody who's 20 or 50 or 60 or whatever age. But it doesn't matter because there's a soulish nature that is responsible for defining and securing our personhood. It doesn't matter that there's different biological states or different states of consciousness or awareness. We all have the value of personhood. And that leads us to this last slide that I want to look at. So what this does, what this kind of approach does, is it places an intransigent gap between human life and other kinds of life, both animal and plant, which is irreconcilable with theistic evolution. You'll see that most argue in those views that there's this continuum, that human, what we are now, is just a continuum from plant to animal to what we are now to even what we will be, as technology changes us and advances us. So the idea of humanness is an evolving concept, but this view says that no, we're affixed as who we are because of how God designed us. And this hierarchical unity of capacities guarantees personhood, like this. A dog with a missing leg is still a dog. A human with a disability is still a person. That doesn't change because a body part is missing. Or, if your, spleen doesn't do what a spleen does or something like that. That doesn't change our personhood nature. Even if it impacts our social awareness and our ability to be a part of society in other ways, it doesn't change our value and dignity and sacredness as a human being. In the same way, red is a color, human is a person. There's no such thing as red without color. There is no such thing as human without person. And those are things. And the last point here, I lied here. I said the last slide. There's one more. All humans, despite their genotypic or phenotypic distinctions, in other words, despite our genetic differences, or phenotype is the outward appearances, our facial structures, our nose, our eyes, or whatever. So regardless of any of those distinctions, all humans are biological descendants and theological dependents on that first couple. We're all biologically connected, but we're also theologically connected in terms of how God has purposed us and created us to live and function as beings in the image of God. And I get to wear my shirt now, see? B'Tselem Elohim is Genesis 1:27. Now, nobody would deny that we're all in the image of God, but we change what that definition means when we don't understand personhood as it's revealed in Scripture. So this view of personhood tied to creation guarantees not just that I can have an opinion that we are all B'Tselem Elohim, created in the image of God, but it guarantees that I have a way that's above culture and above politics to protect the dignity, the sacredness, and worth of every human being, even if it's not politically correct or culturally accepted. And that's the foundation that we have for that. All right, so I'll take questions. But you can find me, as Fuzz said, at morethancake.org. And that's where all my little social media and all that kind of good stuff is at.